palace clock chimed low as dawn hesitated at the horizon. A single phone call sliced the silence like a blade. Captain Malik answered without looking at the caller ID. Maps spread across the table like a battlefield of paper. Photos of a schoolyard were pinned under a trembling thumb. He heard words that made the air in the room thicken. He folded his hands around the receiver as if to hold himself together. Outside, the city stretched asleep, unaware of the storm gathering. A file arrived, stamped urgent, its corners soaked with too many tiny decisions. The voice on the line spoke of children, of a demand that tasted like cruelty. Children's laughter had been replaced by an echoing void. Soldiers moved quietly down hidden corridors, boots soft on polished stone. His advisor handed him a dossier, and his face looked smaller than the news. A looping video played on a screen, grainy and obscene. One general argued for payment, his hands impatient with fear. Captain Malik refused to let fear decide their fate. He paced the room with the patient fury of someone who had loved and lost. A plan began to form, jagged and dangerous and honest. No uniforms, no medals, only people learning to move like shadows. Alpha Team prepared in silence, breath held as if to prevent noise itself. They would travel light and leave nothing behind that could be traced. In the compound where the children were held, ropes creaked in the wind. A boy traced letters on a torn page, the ragged alphabet a prayer. The eldest held a younger hand and whispered a promise about an uncle in an army. Ewan watched the forest like a man counting heartbeats. He spoke into a satellite phone as if he were naming his trophies. The ransom was a number meant to break more than pocketbooks. Captain Malik saw through the veiled transaction to the hands that pushed it. He called his best and told them to become ghosts. No uniforms, no stories for the cameras, only the vow to return children whole. A mother lit a candle and pressed her forehead to a photograph. Maps were traced with fingers that did not tremble as much as they felt. Men in the war room chased bank trails through neat beaches and secret ledgers. They found shell companies with names that smelled of paper and salt. This was not merely terror. It was business with a human face removed. He would not let accounting replace courage. A tracker with a face like a map of scars joined the team. He read footprints as if they were pages from a novel of motion. Each print told a truth. A limp, an awkward step, a child's bare heel. Night folded down like a blanket, and the team moved into quiet places. They crossed rivers by the hush of starlight and the scent of wet earth. A radio whispered coded lies to cover their approach. Someone carried a child's small shoe as if it were a compass. Inside the makeshift cage, eyes watched the trees and counted hours. They vowed to one another in whispered sentences that felt like vows. Ewan slept with the satellite phone like a talisman between his knees. His smile did not reach far. It was a small economy of cruelty. A teacher's scarf fluttered on a fence post, a flapping memory. Captain Malik's strategist spoke in numbers until emotion broke the pattern. Lines were drawn on maps where friends would meet and where they would not. Every move was meant to unbalance the kidnappers and spare the children the spotlight. A dog barked and was swallowed by the distance. The rescue plan had 3 parts: distraction, extraction, and disappearance. They rehearsed the disappearance until it became a ballet of light feet. A false convoy was planted like a story to mislead those watching. Ewan's men argued about streaming and spectacle as if they were merchants. They did not understand the geometry of courage closing upon them. Captain Malik memorized faces from bad footage until they became familiars. He learned the pattern of each child's breath and the tilt of their heads. A mother walked the city and pressed both palms over her sternum. She tried on hope like a fragile garment and found it warm enough to wear. Recon drones circled like silent insects over the canopy. An analyst traced a ping to a clearing by a dried riverbed and held her breath. 2 scouts slipped to the perimeter and found a guard asleep by a small fire. They bound him gently and left him with his pride intact. A satellite ping was jammed and released like a held exhale. Inside the cage, a child hummed the lullaby his grandmother taught him. They counted trees by name and traded stories about mangoes and cricket games. Kewin argued with a boy who wanted to watch the sunset before anything else. Arrogance grew thin when asked to stand against a patient, fierce plan. The extraction point was a ring of scrub and broken rock. A young soldier thought of his sister and tightened his lips against the memory. They advanced with the tenderness of people lifting sleeping birds. The first gunshot was a signal, not a carnage. It shattered the knight's skin and set motion to the rescue. Men shouted commands and the kidnappers stumbled into chaos. The team moved like tide, lifting children and carrying them across the earth. One child flinched at uniforms and then relaxed into a stranger's steady arms. An injured teacher clung to a student's hand until both were safe. Smoke curled from a controlled diversion where old tires burned like dusk. Kewin ran, rage a ragged flag, but feet trained for purpose were faster. They cornered him by a low acacia and took him without ceremony. He spat threats that met few ears and less mercy. The radio said extraction was green, and a dozen breaths exhaled as one. A medic wrapped wounds with practiced speed and muttered soft assurances. Children clung to rescuers who smelled of earth and the taut copper of duty. Captain Malik watched the feed far away and only unclenched when each child blinked. He refused the cameras, but he did not refuse the truth of their faces. They vanished back into the night like a story erased from a slate. The forest closed behind them with a rustle like a lullaby. At the compound gate, mothers saw headlights and fell like trees into screams. Cars spilled people who ran and gathered children into arms that had not quite trusted their own beating. A boy laughed at a mango, and the sound was a small revolution. A teacher with blood on a sleeve folded a child into a shirt and cried without sound. Kewin's capture opened a seam of paper trails and cold accounts. Investigators followed wires that led to numbered banks and polite islands. Captain Malik insisted on transparency for families and secrecy for methods. He would not let politics become the crowd that swallowed rescue. Reporters clamored at gates and were guided away with firm tenderness. The nation watched in fits, in prayers, and in the slow unraveling of fear. Some demanded retribution with the heat of recent grief. Others warned that cycles of retaliation fed themselves like weeds. Captain Malik stood beneath the flags and spoke without flourish. He told families the facts he could and sheltered them from promises he could not make. He spoke of dismantling the networks that traded lives for profit. The community set up tables, offered food, and mended clothing with hands that could not stop. Schoolrooms reopened slowly with new locks and new watchful teachers. Counselors arrived with patient ears and the small medicine of presence. A child learned to draw again, tentative lines widening like returned trust. A mother relearned breathing beyond the immediate day and into a longer future. Kewin was moved into a cell and kept company by his own choices. Investigators traced ledgers and found holes where empathy should have been. They filed charges in courtrooms that rearranged facts like cautious birds. Captain Malik sought cooperation from foreign banks, not cheap applause. He wanted traceable paths for money, not press releases that faded into the night. The rescued slowly became a quiet and stubborn symbol of life. They relearned sleep without the flash of a flashlight and the command of a shout. They relearned small rituals, warm soup, whispered stories, doors closed softly at night. A tree was planted at the schoolyard and the children hammered in the soil together. Its trunk grew crooked and stubborn and proud like a small survivor. Kewin's network loosened, Men were arrested, some paid time with prison and disgrace. But the deeper roots of money twisted on in shadows, resistant to neat endings. Captain Malik sent envoys to banks and to offices with bright logos and dark practices. He pushed for slow change, for new laws that would force visibility on hidden hands. Communities formed watches and improved communication with light, simple radios. A teacher refused a medal and said the truest reward was a child's smile in the morning. Children wrote to each other about becoming pilots and doctors and the small freedoms they loved. One boy wanted to fly above clouds he once thought were walls. Another wanted to learn to stitch wounds so no one else would have to look for cures. They planted more trees and tended them with bright, clumsy hands. The young soldier who had thought of his sister went home and held her hand longer than he used to. A mother stitched a pocket into a child's shirt and placed a small photograph inside. Legal cases crawled forward, and sometimes they felt like the slow fixing of broken music. The nation became a little less naive and a little more prepared. Captain Malik kept his small notebook, and sometimes he would add a name with a careful hand. He taught a class once and said, quietly, that courage was not always loud. It could be a plan, a map, and the stubborn habit of returning to kindness. The children who once huddled in a cage grew into voters and volunteers and distant dreamers. They learned professions, and some of them learned to follow money where it hid. The memory of that terror became part of the national story, told with care and the occasional tear. And in the schoolyard, a new generation chased balls under a tree that had once been planted in fear and had grown into hope.